What's going on, guys? Aegis here. Today we're going to be talking about leveling up our Psyker inside of Warhammer 40k Darktide. Out of all classes in the game, the Psyker has been one of the most played classes of mine since the beta has launched. It is the class I am most comfortable with, especially after coming from Vermintide 2, where I played Sienna for most of my playtime, in particular the Unchained variant, where we were able to play as a very aggressive spell sword. In this guide, I'm going to show you guys what are the best practices to take to level efficiently, what feats to take early on, as well as what gear to buy early and which ones to avoid, as well as what are the best practices for leveling. That will get you guys through the leveling process and actually make use of the character. If you guys want to see us in action, need further advice, or want to hang out with us, please head to my Twitch, links in the description. For a quick overview of the Psyker, the class is best described as an anti-specialist where you are constantly focusing down any elite or special unit that may spawn, especially snipers and heavily armored units with our incredible single target abilities, as well as later on when we get access to our class's unique staff weapons, where we will be able to support our team with crowd control or AoE as well. The Psyker, as well as Sienna back in Vermintide, have a reputation for being one of those classes with high skill ceiling, where you can either be a very clutch pick in games or you can be a liability. Part of the reason being is that you are a glass cannon, where you don't have as much HP as the other classes in the game, and you also have a resource that you must manage on your own through the peril system. More on that later. As with all of my build guides going forward, one of the first things I'm going to tell you just right off the rip is make sure that you are constantly moving. As with any RPG, you are not earning any XP by just standing still inside of the Morningstar or any other hub world, such as the Tower inside of Destiny 2 or the Keep inside of Vermintide 2. Avoid the trap of checking the store after every level, and make sure that you are just getting off to the next mission right away. Speaking of missions, when leveling inside of Darktide, it is heavily advised to stick to difficulty 2, otherwise known as Uprising, especially early on. I would say from the moment that you are able to pick the difficulty, I would just stay there until about level 15 or about level 20 depending on gear and what modifiers are present in the levels that are currently available to you. From level 20 onwards, I would recommend sticking to difficulty 3, otherwise known as Malice, until you hit max level. Difficulty 2 or Uprising is just a very efficient difficulty, especially early on, as you are able to quickly get through these levels, as well as they are the first instances where you were able to actually see mission modifiers like fewer hordes or more hordes, and it is also where you are able to do secondary objectives such as picking up grimoires or picking up scriptures. Even if you feel like Malice or difficulty 3 is the way to go, difficulty 2 is just efficient, especially when pounding through the levels quickly. You want to be constantly moving through these levels, and if you get hung up on, let's say, an assassination mission that's on difficulty 3, or you come across a really bad modifier such as hordes and pick up grimoires, where people in public games are constantly going down and dying, those kind of runs where you just barely scrape by, I would just kind of save yourself the headache and just stick to difficulty 2. It's going to be a lot more efficient in the long run, and that's not to mention, you get more XP by just being able to do more missions than just doing one single solitary mission for the same amount of time. And once you have more levels under your belt, and as well as some gear, then you can go on to Malice and be more of a threat inside that difficulty. So before we get to the leveling tree, let's talk about what the Psyker has built into their kit. Your Blitz ability is going to be Brain Burst, where you can target an enemy and charge the ability to do high damage. This ability can be charged at any range and deals heavy amounts of single target damage. It is best to use this ability against any special or elite, just take care not to target something that you know is about to die, otherwise it's just going to be a waste of damage potential. Use it against something early on in a fight or a horde, or assist in taking down heavy units such as bulwarks or crushers. Our aura is going to be Kinetic Presence, where allies in Coherency gain 10% damage against elite enemies. Coherency, by the way, means the range in which somebody is actually within your aura. Next up is our ultimate ability, which is Psykinetic's Wrath, where you can quill 50% of your peril and stagger enemies in front of you. Peril is a very fickle thing to manage. You must make sure you are on top of the system at all times, otherwise again you will become a liability for your team. Your two iconic traits are going to be Warp Siphon, where killing an enemy with Brain Burst turns into a Warp Charge. Each charge will grant you 3% more damage, and Warp Charges are retained for 25 seconds. You can store up to 4 of these Warp Charges, and later on we will get a feat that will allow us to store up to 6 of these charges as well. Be sure you are not getting hung up on this Warp Charge system. It's good to have, but don't put your run in jeopardy because you are constantly trying to keep these charges. It's great to have them, but you're not hurting yourself by not having them either. And our final trait is going to be Battle Meditation, where you have a 10% chance to quill 10% of your peril on a kill. This is a very good trait, especially when you are not managing your peril actively, or you're in an intense fight and you just have a little more ammo to work with during a horde, or you also get a little extra durability during a fight as well. So for leveling, I would recommend the first trait that you get at level 5 to be Essence Harvest, where you will replenish 30% of your toughness over 5 seconds on getting a Warp Charge. This is a huge talent early on, especially if you haven't been truly lucky in the RNG department inside of the store, because if you don't have a staff, then you can't really make too much use of the other traits on this column. Essence Harvest will allow us to be able to brain burst somebody and just get toughness back, which is huge, especially when you're fighting something in the back line like a sniper, or you're just getting pelted by some of the ranged enemies during a fight, or maybe you were trying to get back in cover and just recover some of your toughness throughout a horde engagement. For our second trait you get at level 10, we're going to get Rack and Ruin, where killing any elite or specialist with Brain Burst applies 2 stacks of Soul Blaze to all enemies within 3 meters of the target. Another really clutch talent, especially if the RNG in the shop hasn't been too generous, or we still don't have a staff to our name. This allows our Brain Burst to have some AoE potential, and also Soul Blaze is a damage modifier where it applies a burning stack of damage over time to an enemy, which gives us a little more utility during those horde fights. For our third trait that you get at level 15, we're going to take Psychic Communion. Upon whenever you or an ally in Coherency kills an enemy, you have a 4% chance to gain a warp charge. This trait will allow us to automate our warp charge generation as well as keep our uptake on damage, especially if our party is kind of taking our warp charges away from us by killing any of the enemies we are trying to brain burst, which this is a constant thing that will happen to you, by the way. For our fourth trait that you get at level 20, we're going to take Mind in Motion, where your movement speed is not reduced while quelling peril. This talent is very clutch, especially during horde engagements. You don't want to be slowed down during a fight. Most of your damage is coming from your brain burst, and if you're sitting there trying to quell your peril during a fight, you're not actually putting out damage, and you are just a sitting duck while you're waiting for your ammo to basically come back to you. For our fifth talent that you get at level 25, we are going to take Warp Battery, where you can store up to 6 warp charges. This is a very good talent to take later on, especially once we get to those later difficulties like Malice, where you are not just constantly one-tapping any of the enemies anymore, as well as at least letting you keep your damage potential up in those later stages as well. For our last talent that you get at level 30, we're going to get Kinetic Barrage. For 10 seconds after using Psykinetic's Wrath, your Brain Burst will charge 25% faster and consume 50% less of your peril. So for a whole 10 seconds, you get a faster charge time on your Brain Burst, which is going to be an immense single target DPS, especially when you come against a boss. This trait was made under the pretense that we have not really gained any good weapons from the shop, and we are basically reliant on our built-in kit to do damage when it comes to having to take out any special. We're going to use our Brain Burst to do so. When it comes to AoE, we're going to be in melee combat for most of the time, and when it comes to range combat, again, just use your Brain Burst mostly, or whatever range weapon you actually have to hand. During the part of the leveling process where I talked about how to level fast and efficient inside of Darktide, you don't want to be standing at the store for too long, especially because you're trying to get these levels fast. Your levels are very important in order to actually get more of the juicier weapons later on. Most classes in Darktide, barring the Ogren, whose weapons are unique to that class, have their unique weapons tied to their level. So the more levels you have, the better the gear will be. When talking about what weapons to take, we need to separate this into their 2 respective categories of ranged and melee. Every weapon inside of Darktide has their intended feature and function, and you must make sure that your build at least covers these functions like AoE and single target, and close to mid-range versus long range. When it comes to what weapons we will be taking early for the Psyker, most of our single target and a lot of our range is coming from Brain Burst, so we really don't need to worry too much about our range options early on, but what we do need though in heaps is an AoE weapon, something for close quarters. For this, we're going to be using the Catachan Mach 1 Devil's Claw Sword. It is a sword that you start with early on, and it comes with Vanguard and Relentless as both of their attack modifiers. Attack modifiers are very important inside of Darktide, as that lets you know what the weapon is capable of and what its intended damage is meant to be for. For instance, a weapon that rolled with Assassin is going to be a lot better at single target than, say, a weapon that rolled Relentless. For the Claw Sword, it rolled both Vanguard and Relentless, which they are both heavily good at AoE. When using the Claw Sword, it is best to stick to the heavy attacks, as that will cover the most range, as the heavy have rolled Relentless. Relentless is by far the best for AoE coverage as well as crowd control. Stick to your light attacks when you are down to the minimal amount of enemies, or when you need to target a particular enemy as the final attack in the light attack sequence, rolled Strike Down, which is very good for single target. Another option to take if you want to mix things up a little while leveling is going to be the Catachan Mach 3 Combat Blade. Now this weapon doesn't roll any AoE modifiers like Vanguard or Relentless, but it has wild swings and arcs that can control the flow of a horde. And it has some of the best mobility of any melee weapon we currently have in the game. This will allow you to weave in and out of engagements quickly and also move a lot faster. Our endgame weapon is going to be the Force Sword. It is extremely good. A lot of people really knocked the sword during the first phase of the beta, but after people started playing with it a lot more, we started figuring out that this weapon is very good, especially after the changes to Psyker that made the peril system a lot easier to manage. It has very good crowd control through the use of its push attack, and it also makes use of your warp abilities, and this will synergize well with our endgame tree as well. When it comes to range for the Psyker, there are not too many options. You don't want to be sitting there using your lasgun or any other ranged weapon for that matter, because there are classes that can just make better use of those weapons than you can, and not to mention, you have an infinite ammo resource through peril that is being underutilized. Remember that most of our range is actually coming from Brain Burst. You have infinite range, infinite ammo, and you can also use this from any range and charge at any time and kill any enemy. You don't need to use a pistol at all. Instead, when you are able to, make sure that you buy your class's staff, because that's where the Psyker really shines, and when you don't have these weapons, it really makes the experience kind of dull. A lot of these staffs offer incredible utility in the form of crowd control, AoE, or single target burst. And something else that is nice about the staffs is that they can easily quell your peril, because they can roll modifiers that can reduce the amount of peril that you have a lot faster than when you're just using Brain Burst. Throughout the leveling process, until you actually have a staff to your name, the first staff that will drop at level 5 isn't usable until level 8. And even then, I don't recommend it. I'll explain why later on. Our class doesn't truly take off until level 10 when we get access to an actual good staff, which is the Nominous Mach 6 Surge Force staff, otherwise known as the Lightning Staff. This staff is really good at crowd control, allowing your team some breathing room to work on tougher enemies or lock down harder hitting enemies like the mutants. And I would recommend getting this staff the moment it is available. The next weapon, and personally my favorite staff, is the Equinox Mach 4 Void Strike Force Staff, or otherwise known as the Projectile Staff. It is the best staff for horde clearing. The staff will allow you to take on hordes all on your own, and has great synergy with the Psychic Communion feat we took early on. Know that this is going to be up to you whether you want to use the Lightning Staff or the Projectile Staff for the endgame. You can use both if you really want to, depending on team composition. I prefer the latter of the two because I just like being able to down hordes quickly, which I find really good for those harder difficulties, but you're not going to be doing yourself a disservice by taking the Lightning Staff either, because being able to control hordes is also good during those harder difficulties. When it comes to curios and leveling, there's not really a wrong answer to take here. Personally for me, I would prefer to take anything that had rolled max stamina or plus to wound with the suffix of either max health or more experience. So here's what our endgame tree will look like with both the Force Sword and either the Lightning or Projectile Staff. It is a build that will allow us to use peril to block instead of stamina, which will in turn allow us to tank as well. We also heal when we kill enemies with our warp ability, so that means the lightning from the Lightning Staff, the projectile from the Void Strike Staff, or even the activation ability on the Force Sword, which is going to be a lot better for your overall survivability. With all that being said, guys, that brings us to the end of the video. If you liked what I put out here, be sure to let me know what class you would like me to see do next, as I do plan on making a leveling guide for each of the classes that we have so far. I wanted to make these videos as I haven't really been seeing anybody talk about how the leveling process actually is, and I've been seeing a lot of people make videos on how good these classes are when you actually have the levels, but what about before that? Let me know down in the comments what you would like to see next, and as always, thank you for watching.